So please help me welcome Anthony Sammarco. Thank you.
Yay. It's always nice when it starts. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's even more of a pleasure to be out of the office. So today's lecture is on the history of Baker's chocolate. And I think everyone here remembers something about Baker's chocolate. It was probably the most proficient as well as largest produced chocolate in the country in the 19th century. But ironically, it's also the oldest chocolate manufacturer in the North America. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. My advance was a little quick. But Baker's chocolate itself, as I mentioned, is the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in North America. And when it was founded, it was basically to use, as we see here, the trademark known as La Belle Chocolatière. Baker's chocolate in the period of the 17th and 18th century was something that many people perceived of as a treat or a luxury. But the idea is that Baker's was actually founded by Dr. James Baker. And seen here, Baker was not only a graduate of Harvard College, graduating in the class of 1760, but he would go on to actually study for the ministry, be a school teacher, and also, after 9 months of arduous study, attain the title of Doctor of Medicine. He used that title of Doctor of Medicine until the day he died, though it's not actually recorded what he treated. But in 1765, he was keeping a general store in what was then called Baker's Corners, or what we call Cobman Square in Dorchester today, where he supposedly met a man by the name of John Hannon. And Hannon, according to the history of Dorchester, was said to be a penniless Irish immigrant who had no prospects in life and no money whatsoever. However, he did have the skill of making chocolate, and Dr. Baker, a very adventurous and great investor, set him up in a small mill on the Dorchester side of the Neponset River. The building, which was a wood frame structure, 1.5 stories in height, was a place initially where we had seen cornmeal having been ground. But in 1765, Dr. Baker took out a 10-year lease for the production of chocolate. And in this 1937 rendition, we see John Hannon waving to people in the boat in the foreground and an idea of how it might have all started. Well, chocolate in this period of time was also quite interesting. It wasn't known as Baker's. It was actually known as Hannon's Best Chocolate. And this chocolate wrapper, which was produced in the 1765 to 1779 period, was printed in what was then known as the Boys and McLean paper mill, the oldest paper mill in New England, which was also on the banks of the Neponset River. After 14 years of partnership, the two men had become wealthy because chocolate was something combined with sugar and other ingredients that was quite palatable. But in 1779, the history tells us that Hannon decided to go to the West Indies to procure cacao beans. He never returned, and supposedly his widow, who was once quoted in the history of Dorchester in 1859 as a, quote, shrew, unquote, was a woman that was thought to have sent her husband back to his native land in Ireland, where he lived out his years in great splendor. In 1780, she sold her half share of the business to Dr. Baker, and the House of Baker's Chocolate was incorporated. But the idea is that when we think of chocolate, we always seem to think of the end product. And the end product itself is actually derived from this, the Theobroma cacao tree. The tree itself grows in warm climates, Africa, the West Indies, South America. It's dwarf-like, no more than 12 to 15 feet in height, and it actually, as we see, has branches extending from the trunk itself. But the interesting thing is it actually grows cacao pods, and these pods actually grow not only from the branches of the tree, but the trunk as well. The tree has ripenings twice annually, and the pods themselves are anywhere from 13 to 14 inches in length, and a circumference of anywhere from 8 to 9 inches. And in this late 18th century print, we see the cacao pod with the leaves and the flowers to show what it would have looked like. But the ironic thing was that during the period of the late 17th and early 18th century, there were enormous plantations of just cacao trees. Here in a cross-section of a cacao pod, we see the opening of 2 seeds, and these were cacao seeds, roughly the size of one's thumbnail. And each of these pods, when broken open, would have anywhere from 40 to 60 individual cacao seeds that would be broken away from the husk itself and then allowed to air and sun dry. Well, the process, beginning in the late 16th century, when we saw it being cultivated by the Dutch and French, was really no different than by the 18th century, when the bakers themselves began to procure the beans. Here in photographs of the mid-20th century, these plantations we worked at that time by slaves, now by minusculely paid labor, who would actually cultivate the trees, actually knock the pods from the trees as they ripened, and then eventually break them open, where hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds would actually be in front of each of the workers. And during this period, the seeds themselves would then be washed and then air and sun dried. And it would take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks at the most, especially in this warm climate of South America, the Caribbean, or Africa, for the beans to actually dry completely. And once they were dried, they had a shelf life of anywhere from 10 to 20 years with no adverse effect whatsoever. Well, the ironic thing was that these were the beans that would eventually be sent to Dorchester. And we know baker's chocolate. The concept is, yes, it was the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in North America. But chocolate had been known even in the period of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century in the Aztec and Mayan cultures. And seen here, a man from an Aztec painting, probably of the 17th century, actually grinds the cacao beans themselves in a mortar and pestle type instrument. We would see that here it was to be produced chocolatl, a savory drink that was flavored with pepper and vanilla, unlike the sugar that we use for chocolate. And during this period of time, the Aztecs and Mayans would have people here, a man actually with a quizzle stick. And the quizzle stick would always be placed into the beverage, rubbed between one's hands to create a froth, and we would actually see it being drunk out of a coconut shell, such as on the lower left-hand side. If one was aristocracy, it was usually bound in silver or royalty in gold, and it was a very primitive form of a loving cup, but it was filled with chocolatl. And in many ways, it would actually be the conquistadors who would actually get the recipe of chocolatl from here, Montezuma. And in this conjectural painting of the 1930s, we see them trading a treaty for the recipe of chocolatl. And eventually the conquistadors would return to Spain, where they would introduce to Western Europe the savory drink that would eventually become known as cocoa. Well, in some ways, baker's chocolate continued that tradition. For 3 generations, the Baker family owned and operated the mills in Dorchester and Milton, Massachusetts, in an area that's often called the Lower Mills. Walter Baker, the grandson of Dr. James Baker, was educated at Harvard, like his father, Edmund, and his grandfather, Dr. James Baker. However, following his graduation from Harvard in 1811, he actually was educated at Judge Tappan Reeves Law School in Litchfield, Connecticut. He obtained a degree in law where he protected the name of Baker's chocolate from others that invaded its trademark. For by the period of the 1840s, we saw 7 manufacturers of Baker's chocolate. With the addition of a name or a letter, or simply just changing the spelling, we saw Baker's quite proficient. By the 1840s, they had outgrown that small mill, and what was built was a stone mill. And this stone mill was designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant, a well-known architect whose father, Gridley Bryant, invented the quarrying techniques of granite at the Quincy quarries for the Bunker Hill Monument. The building was 4 stories in height, built on the site of the original wood 1.5-story factory, but in some ways it would change completely. Walter Baker continually invested in his business, and we saw his trademark was a young maiden spewing forth with a cornucopia of the different types of chocolate that were produced. The idea was that in some ways Walter Baker himself was probably one of the best businessmen in the family. The unfortunate thing was he died young. He died in 1852, and he left a widow who lived here on Summer Street in Boston, but summered in Dorchester. And until her death in 1891, she received 1/3 of all net profits, which was a substantial amount of money. And I wish my attorneys would negotiate that for my business. However, after 2 years with his brother-in-law Sidney Williams running the business, the company went into an abeyance. His only son lived abroad in London, and his daughter lived in Paris. So the idea was that the one man left was his step-nephew, Henry Lilly Pierce, who was actually a $3 a week counting clerk at the Baker Chocolate Company. He became president of the company, and he signed a 10-year lease guaranteeing to the heirs of the Baker estate $3,000 annually. It was a tremendous sum of money when a well-to-do man would expect no more than $500 a year income. Well, during this period, between 1854 and eventually his death in 1896, Henry Pierce would multiply the company 40-fold. He was a man who was not just president of Baker's, but he would also serve as mayor of Boston in 1872 and 1877, as a United States congressman, and a man who traveled abroad every summer of his life to actually inspect the manufacturers of chocolate in Germany, France, and other companies. But the idea was that Henry Pierce invested tremendously. He had bought the name, and along with it came that one building known as the Old Stone Building. And between 1854 and 1871, that was the only production of chocolate that took place. Eventually, Pierce would have a much larger complex, but he was still producing chocolate that required cacao beans. And here in a photograph of the 1880s, we saw these dried cacao beans coming in large canvas sacks, usually with the stencil of the country of origin and a date. Inspectors would look at these, they would then be crated and again marked with country of origin and date, and they would have a shelf life of anywhere from 10 to 20 years. But what they did begin to do was change the production. No longer were cacao beans roasted over an open fire and ground by grist mills. By the period of the 1850s and 1860s, they were now being actually roasted, as we see here, with German imported rotisseries as well as fulling machines. We would see a conveyor belt at the top bringing the dried beans along, where they would then be dropped into the rotisseries, and the fulling machine would remove the outer casing of the cacao seed. And once that was done, there was a glutinous substance seen on the left-hand side that was much like fudge, except it was actually a 50% fat content. And if your mother ever told you that chocolate was fattening, this is the process that would remove much of it. 50% was comprised of cocoa butter. And in the 18th and early 19th century, it was usually extracted and simply discarded. Eventually, it would be sold to the cosmetic industry, and lipstick is made from cocoa butter. But in this period of time, these men would actually lay these out to air and sun dry. They would be graded and refined in the beginning process of making different forms of chocolate and cocoa. Well, in the 19th century, we would see in some ways that one of the best of the chocolate produced was known as Premium No. 1. This was a chocolate, remember, this is baking chocolate, not sweet. It was actually produced in such a way that it would be wrapped in a blue label and a cream label affixed to it, where it was actually marketed as its best and most expensive product. But bakers made a large number, and just a few included German sweet chocolate, as still available today in the supermarkets. In 1819, Walter Baker hired a coachman by the name of Samuel German, and he was from Germany. He himself was his coachman for close to 10 years, and eventually he became a chocolate maker in the mills at the lower mills. He came up with the ingenious idea of combining cocoa beans with chocolate beans and coffee beans to make a rich, dense flavor that was eventually to become German sweet chocolate. And in this instance, Walter Baker purchased the recipe for $1,000, which was 10 times Samuel German's annual salary. And in this period of time, he magnanimously named it after him, and it's still available in supermarkets today. But it has a different colored label. It's polychromatic. Another type of chocolate was vanilla chocolate or white chocolate. I don't know if you like white chocolate, but it has no chocolate whatsoever. It's 85% cocoa butter, a little bit of flour, a little bit of sugar, and vanilla flavoring. And it's probably the most fattening of the chocolates that are produced. However, this was wrapped in a white wrapper with a red ribbon and label chocolatier, so we know it's after 1872. But if we were a marketing agent for any large company, we'd realize that we weren't standardizing our product. We had a blue label on premium number 1, polychromatic on German sweet chocolate, and a white label on vanilla. We also had to realize that 1 out of every 3 Americans at this time was illiterate, and a color coding was very beneficial, unless you were like me and were colorblind. But the idea was it wasn't just chocolate, but it was also cocoa. And 50% of the overall annual sales in the 19th century was cocoa. And this cocoa was something that was not only touted as a breakfast cocoa, thought to be a nutritious as well as beneficial vitamin-wise drink, but it was something that you could enjoy that tasted good. Well, during this period of time, Henry Pierce also augmented his workers. It wasn't just men working in the factory, but it had at least 65% women by the period of 1875. And the women primarily worked as wrappers. And these were wrapping stations. Each woman had a work area. She would take the raw pieces of chocolate, wrap them in paper, and affix a label. But the idea was, in some ways, that they could wrap anywhere from 250 to 300 bars of chocolate daily. They also began to produce in the 1870s receipt books, much like the things that were done in the 18th century. But these were done in such a way as to allow people to experiment with the combination of chocolate with creams and sugars and other types of ingredients to make recipes that you could actually impress family and friends. The first recipe book, and this is quite ratty, was 1871. It was no more than 12 pages in length, and it even instructed a person how to properly melt chocolate without burning it. But the recipe books became increasingly elaborate. And in 1876, during the country's centennial, this book was published, beautiful polychromatic cover, along with 4 gold medals in each of the corners. And these were gold medals won in nationwide as well as international competitions for the quality of the product. And Baker's was competing against the likes of Nestle's, Tobler, Cadbury, and other well-known chocolate manufacturers from Europe. And what they were winning were things that were actually quite unique. This book was published with 76 pages in honor of this 1876. But the interior of each of these books would have recipes that were devised by people such as Miss Parola and Miss Burr. These were 2 women, like the wrappers, who worked at Baker's Chocolate. These women were quite well known. And in the 19th century, it were these 2 women that tasted almost everything. No photograph has come down to us, but after probably close to 40 cookbooks over 40 years, we began to realize that Baker's had actually produced a quality product. But there was one woman who actually wrote for this in such a way that began to make people look differently at chocolate. Yes, the cookbooks had wonderful things such as Vassar fudge, Wellesley fudge, Radcliffe fudge, but it would also have things as chocolate charlotte and much more exotic things that if you followed the recipe to a T, you too could make. But the woman in question was Ellen Richards. And Ellen Richards was a very important person. In her day, she was probably the best-known food critic in the 19th century. She had been graduated from Vassar College, and later she became, quote, an experimental student, unquote, at MIT, where she was the first female student. She would eventually go on to become quite well known as a nutritionist, and eventually she married her professor, Ralph Richards of Jamaica Plain, and the 2 of them throughout their lifetime began to talk about the quality of chocolate and its nutritional quality. I like this woman already. Well, during the period of her lifetime, it wasn't just the fact that she wrote a column in the Baker cookbooks extolling the virtues of chocolate in a daily diet, But she also went on to found such places as the New England Soup Kitchen that provided inexpensive and highly nutritious soups and stews for many of the new immigrants coming to Boston who neither had the time, the energy, or even the money to actually purchase and take the time to do it. Well, these cookbooks were quite important, and we realized in some ways that Henry Pierce himself not only invested heavily in the production and sale of these books, but he would also build new factories. And during the period between 1871, when he constructed the Pierce Mill, and the period of his death in 1896, he had increased the buildings by 7. The Pierce Mill, seen here, was designed by Nathaniel Bradley in conjunction with Winslow and Wetherall. This firm and its successors was designed 10 of the now 11 extant buildings that would create one of the best preserved examples of a mill industry in the city of Boston. And during the period of the early 1880s, we would also see the Webb Mill being built on the Milton side of the river at the corner of Adams and Elliott Street. And this building was designed by Winslow and Wetherall and named for the former competitor, Webb and Twombly Chocolate Mill. During the period of the 19th century, Baker's was not the only producer of chocolate in the Dorchester area. There was Dr. Ware's Chocolate, Preston's Chocolate, and Webb and Twombly, eventually to be known just as Webb Chocolate Company. Henry Pierce purchased all of his former competitors and incorporated them into his business, so that by the time of 1881, when he purchased Webb and Webb Chocolate Company, he would name the former competitors' buildings after them. And actually they're still known as such today. We would also see in some ways the Adams Street building on the far left-hand side, just to the left of the Pierce building. And today, if you do travel through the lower mills, you'll realize how many of these buildings survive, but survive today in a different guise of luxury condominiums, affordable apartments, and artists' lofts. But the idea is in some ways that Henry Pierce also invested heavily in marketing his chocolate. He did not only local agricultural shows, exhibitions, and the like, but he also did such things as the Columbian Centennial, one of the major shows in 1893. And the idea was that in this instance he hired the New York architectural firm of Carey and Hastings to design a pavilion that was intended to last no more than 6 months, where people would ascend a staircase on either side and enter into a large room where demonstrators were located, where you could watch them producing the things that were available through the cookbook. And in some ways, the interiors were actually filled with all sorts of chocolate items. They would set up the demonstrators, these large triangular-shaped displays, along with apothecary jars that would be filled with bonbons, all made from the cookbook. And in some ways, there would be demonstrations, such as this woman frosting a chocolate cake with devil's food frosting. She holds a piece of Dorchester pottery, which was being made locally at the time, and the idea was that in some ways it was fun to watch, but it was even more fun when the cake was cut and you were allowed to taste how delicious Baker's chocolate really was. Well, each of these pavilions also had small writing tables which were equipped with postcards of La Belle Chocolatière. They were all pre-posted so that all you had to do was write home to family and friends and say, "I've tasted Baker's chocolate, and so too shouldn't you." And word-of-mouth publicity increased their sales tremendously. In some ways, they also did premiums. And in the period of the late 19th century, they hired an English firm known as Shelley to produce bone china, cocoa cups, and saucers. And seen here with the embossed La Belle Chocolatière in profile, these would also be augmented by Dresden as well as Lamanche, and we would see that people would collect these. Very unlike the Duz dishwashing detergent with the juice glass when I was a child, today these have become quite collectible. And if Baker's was purported to be the best chocolate in the world, what better way than to stir it with a silver spoon? This premium was made by Oneida Silversmiths in upstate New York. The sterling spoons cost a dime. However, the silver plate spoons were free for the asking. All you had to do was simply return box top labels. But the idea was that these premiums all extolled the virtues of Baker's chocolate. And even cocoa pots, such as this, that I found only a few months ago, would make it a wonderful accoutrement for an afternoon of cocoa. Well, in some ways it wasn't just china, but it would also include even serving trays. And this serving tray shows in the bottom a small house which was built for the Jamestown exhibition of 1907 in Virginia. And the building itself was designed by Milton architect Edwin Lewis, but ironically, to save cost, after the exhibition closed, it wasn't demolished, but it was brought back to Milton Hill, where it was fitted and sold as a private residence. But we see all of these things as important things, but it's also the fact they made women's jewelry. And this is a brooch showing La Belle Chocolatier. It was a sterling pin with an enamel overlay. So we realized that these premiums were an important feature of their overall sales. Well, Henry Pierce during this period of time would also basically look at advertisements as an important feature. And during the late 19th and early 20th century, advertisements in magazines such as Liberty's, Collier's, the Youth's Companion, the St. Nicholas magazine, were available to people not just locally but throughout the United States. Many people began to look at these full-page color advertisements as things that were not just artistic, but something that stuck in one's mind as he or she was shopping. Here, a young girl, blonde and blue-eyed, cutting out a doll from a paper, says, "Now I have my dolly, pretty soon I'll have my cocoa." Well, if she was our daughter or granddaughter, I don't think we'd refuse her the baker's chocolate. But the idea was, in some ways, it was people of all walks of life, even including the doughboys in World War I in France, were visiting French inns not for the wine, but for a steaming pot of baker's cocoa. And we see a woman serving them. Of course, it's far-fetched, but the idea is that it was a delicious accoutrement to an afternoon. But they also made forays into mythology. And now, Little Red Riding Hood no longer approached grandmother's house with anything less than a basket of Christmas dainties that included baker's cocoa and chocolate. So the idea was, in some ways, that bakers saw these advertisements as an important feature of getting the word out. And by making people chuckle or smile, we saw that it was a positive reinforcement. At the turn of the 20th century, bakers decided to produce a calendar that was called in this way the Calendar of Bakers, because it went the gamut from the period of 1780, when it was founded as the House of Baker's Chocolate, to 1900. And it included, purportedly, 6 generations of Americans that knew and loved chocolate. Well, if you think 20 years for every generation, that's pretty generous, I think, in a lot of ways. My grandfather was 59 when my mother was born, so I guess we skewed the ratio. But in 1780, we see here a woman of the young republic drinking cocoa. It says that my lady drinks her first cup of baker's cocoa, that the House of Walter Baker and Company was founded in the year 1780 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And 20 years later, or the next generation, the fame of baker's cocoa grows with that of the young republic. And I love these quotations. It says, "Pure cocoa acts as a gentle stimulant and invigorates and corrects the action of digestive organs." Not only did it taste good, but it was good for you. And the next generation, to speed the parting guest, Walter Baker and Company's cocoa is known and served in every hostelry or inn or tavern. On a journey, you cannot take any refreshment so wholesome, sustaining, and delicious. And in 1840, doctors now recommend baker's chocolate as a beneficent restorer of exhaustive power. It's a perfect food, preserves health, prolongs life, and soothes both stomach and brain. And in this advertisement, if you look at the woman, she's laying on a recamier lounge as she's being spoon-fed liquid chocolate out of a port glass. And I wonder if her headband is a fashion statement or if she's trying to soothe her brain. And in 1860, it's the fashion to take a cup of baker's chocolate after a constitutional. And it says that the people who make constant use of chocolate are the ones who enjoy the most steady health and are the least subject to a multitude of little ailments which destroy the comfort of life. And in 1880, La Belle Chocolatier now enters millions of homes as the trademark of the finest chocolate and cocoa in the world. And a booklet of choice recipes, as we've seen, by Miss Parola and other noted teachers will be sent free on application to Walter Baker and Company. However, the last generation, if she continued to drink her cocoa, she'd never keep this hourglass figure. But we realize that the Gibson girl was the personification of the sixth generation descendant of La Belle Chocolatière, seen in the upper right-hand corner. And in some ways that no other company producing chocolate in the United States could even claim this length of time or service. And it became an important feature of Baker's as being not just the oldest producer of chocolate in North America, but in this instance, purportedly, the best. Well, La Belle Chocolatière had been the trademark since 1871. She was an original painting that actually was known as Das Schokoladenmädchen. It still hangs in the Dresden Art Gallery in Germany. She had been painted in 1765 by the court painter Jean-Étienne Liotard. Liotard was in Austria painting members of the Austrian court, and Maria Theresa, the empress, actually had a nephew known as Prince Denrickson. Prince Denrickson fell in love with a woman named Anna Baltuf. And though she was of the petty nobility, she was not royal, and she was a chocolate server. She worked in a chocolate shop afternoons, where she eventually met her future husband, the prince. And for her wedding portrait, he had her painted by the court painter, and we saw her as an important feature. However, Henry Pierce had fallen in love with the painting, and the museum decided they did not wish to part with it. He had a copy made, and when it was brought back to the United States, all of a sudden, Das Schokoladenmädchen had become La Belle Chocolatière, and consequently, she has been known as such since. During this period, Baker's was actually sent by both rail, because we had the Dorchester and Milton branch of the Old Colony Railroad, but it was also delivered by horse and wagon. And seen here in a photograph of the 1890s, these wagons usually had tarpaulins on the sides, emblazoned with La Belle Chocolatière. But the ironic thing is that by the 1940s, in many instances, over half of the chocolate wasn't sent by horse or even railroad. It was sent in a liquid format in a tanker car. And though this is a toy tanker car, I admit, it once held 40,000 gallons of liquid chocolate. Now that's a train I'd like to hit. 40,000 gallons of liquid chocolate could also be kept under climate control, so there was no adverse effect. If you've ever had a chocolate bar that you forgot on the front seat of your automobile, and you came back 10 minutes later in the summer, you begin to realize how shelf life of chocolate is imperative. But during this period of time, we also realized in the 40s and 50s that Baker's was competing against other companies such as Nestle's and Hershey's. They began to streamline their cookbooks, and this was called a sampler cookbook. It was really no more than 15 pages, and it was also showing on the cover what was the greatest hope of probably any American housewife's dream at the time, a layer cake. And of course, this layer cake with frosting made with white vanilla chocolate and grated chocolate as decoration was something in some ways that many people actually strove to reproduce. And the cookbooks were important, but they also made forays into such things as milk chocolate bars. And today, when we think of readily edible chocolate bars, we always think of Hershey's. And the idea was that, yes, Milton Hershey, who produced chocolate in Hershey, Pennsylvania, had actually started in such a way with two former chocolate makers for Baker's, but he also had cornered the market. For unlike Baker's, which was baking chocolate, the only time we ever use it is to make something or at 3 a.m. when we're home and there's nothing else to eat, we began to realize that Baker's didn't do as well with their chocolate bars. One thing they did do, which was an unfortunate circumstance that was never copyrighted, was to make what were called sweet chocolate tablets. These were available in small boxes. It looks like a cigarette package, but these were actually pieces of milk chocolate covered in a candy coating. And if it sounds like an M&M, it is an M&M, but they were called sweet chocolate tablets. If I was wanting something nice, I don't think I'd want tablets, I'd want M&Ms. They didn't copyright it, and eventually M&Ms became the choice. And in the 40s and 50s, we also saw the standardization, such as the producing of cardboard tins of cocoa, and women no longer in silk gowns but now rayon, drip-dry outfits that look like La Belle Chocolatière, but albeit 2 centuries later. And they also made larger bars of chocolate for commercial consumption. Many hand-dipped chocolate shops would buy these 25-pound bars of milk chocolate, where they would then produce bonbons themselves. Well, Baker's unfortunately couldn't compete, and we saw the company having been sold in 1927 to the Postum Corporation, or what is today known as General Foods. And eventually, in 1981, the company was sold to Kraft Family Foods, which still owns it and still produces chocolate under the name. We know of it as Baker's chocolate, but La Belle Chocolatière was truly a well-known German painting, and she's beloved by the people of Germany. And in the period of the post-war years, Germany decided to produce a postage stamp. It was 10 Deutschmarks, but it shows here Lyotard's painting, and in one way actually showing how important it was, not just in America, but also in Germany. Well, in the 1950s, we began to see that the women known as demonstrators, seen here at the foot of the staircase of the administration building, would greet honored guests with trays of hot cocoa and all sorts of delicacies made from the different cookbooks. In the period of the 40s and 50s, these were an important feature because the women went out to almost every imaginable church fair, agricultural show, as well as international exhibitions. But they got a little older, and seen here in the 1960s, many of the demonstrators, some of whom worked over 50 years at Baker's Chocolate, had actually begun in some ways to see the company declining in its overall production and marketing skills. Here they hand out 1-pound circular discs of milk chocolate. This was at a fair called the Sweet Shop at the Second Church in Dorchester's Common Square. But the idea was that bakers, by the period of the mid-1960s, had begun to fall onto hard times. They were a baking chocolate company. They were not a readily edible chocolate company. And the consequence was that with taxes in Massachusetts and the inability to expand, the company was moved to Dover, Delaware, where it still produced. And we saw in some ways that the buildings, of which there are 11 that survive in the lower mills to construe, as I said, I think the best preserved example of a mill industry in Boston, the buildings would eventually be used for different purposes. By the early 1980s, the Pierce Mill seen in the distance was actually restored for affordable and mixed housing, such as apartments, by Keene Corporation, and eventually we would see luxury condominiums and now artists' lofts. And as the sign says, the home of Walter Baker and Company. But today, when we go to the supermarket, and if we see Baker's Chocolate on the aisle, we begin to realize it's no longer the full-color La Belle Chocolatière. She's now a silhouette in profile. But we realize in this way that she is one of the oldest registered trademarks in the food industry in the United States. And she represents not just the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in North America, but today she represents a delicious memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions? Yes? Well, broma is an effervescent drink that is often made with such things as soda water. And if you are a very Tony person and go to Newbury Street in the summer months, you can have what we would call cold cocoa, but it's an effervescent drink, and it's enjoyed usually in Europe. The other thing is, chocolate receipts were things that we would always know a cookbook as a receipt book in the 18th century. And because Baker's is the oldest manufacturer of chocolate, they called them receipt books for close to 25 years. Now they're recipe books. It occurred primarily by the 20th century because most people didn't understand what a receipt book was. So the consequence is, I always look at them as receipt books. If you ever think of your grandmother's cookbook, they always have little pins with the recipes actually there. And it was called a receipt book. It was the old English terminology. Yes?
Was the plant native to
The plant was primarily native to South America. However, there were plantations in Africa, the West Indies, and South America. I don't know exactly how they got to Africa, but the thing was, it was known that actually there were plantations by the mid-18th century in Africa, but primarily it began in South America. Yeah, yes? Well, the administration building, which was designed by George Shepherds of the firm of Shepard and Stearns, has just been restored as artists' lofts, and it was thought that they would have a small museum there. But I would think that anything on chocolate would be wonderful, not just for adults, but especially children. And the whole history of chocolate, especially because it was made there, I think would be a great venue. Of course, it wouldn't be anything as interesting as the Old South Meeting House. But the idea is, in some ways, I think it would be a very nice venue. And again, something on the food industry. So hopefully it'll happen, probably not within the next year or two, but one can hope. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you all.